I'll start.
Well, you have to wait for them all to file in first. Oh, here they come.
Good evening. My name is Nora Krug, and I'm Executive Director of the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the kickoff of a virtual event series with acclaimed author and graphic artist, Nora Krug. This series is presented by the German Consulate General in Vancouver in cooperation and with the support of the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center, the University of British Columbia, and the University of Victoria. Although the partners initially planned to present Nora to an in-person audience in Vancouver, we are so pleased that given the circumstances, Nora agreed to participate in a suite of online events dedicated to her visual memoir, Belonging, A German Reckons with History and Home. We are honored that she is with us virtually to engage in discussion about her book, which explores themes of identity, memory, inherited responsibility, and the cultural legacies of war with such great intimacy, depth, and resonance. I am now pleased to call on the Deputy Consul General of Germany in Vancouver, Birgit Dench, to offer words of welcome.
Thank you, Nina. Good evening from Vancouver, and thank you all for joining us tonight. It is a great pleasure for us to welcome you to the opening event of our series with German-American graphic novelist Nora Krug. This year, in March, Germany took over the chair of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance for 1 year. Today, the IRA counts 34 member states, including Canada and the United States of America. Remembering for the future is one of the topics to which we would like to dedicate ourselves with cross-border and intergenerational projects during the German chair. And my colleagues and I believe that Nora Krug's award-winning book, Heimat, a German family album, perfectly matches this theme. Today, people in the midst of our society question the Holocaust, trivialize and falsify history. They are looking for the answers to today's challenge in nationalism, in isolation from strangers, and stir up anti-Semitism and racism. Anti-Semitism is a sign of a profound anti-democratic ideology. The fight against anti-Semitism is about defending basic values and social solidarity and is a topic priority of the German government. Very soon, no survivors of the Holocaust and World War II will be able to tell us their story. It is up to us all, to all of us, to keep their memories alive and to counter historical ignorance to ensure that the horrors of the past must not take place again. By telling the story of her family, Nora Krug is making a valuable contribution to this. I would like to express my sincere thanks to our partners who all contributed to this true co-production. Nina Krieger, you just have met from the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center, Professor Charlotte Chalier and Dr. Matthew Pollard at UVic, and Dr. Viz Neidam and Dr. Yuma Kuma and Florian Gassner at UBC. And of course, our two main ladies for tonight, Marsha Lederman and Nora Krug. And now, without further delay, I wish you a very interesting and delightful evening with Nora Krug and Marsha Lederman, and give back to Nina. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Consul General Dench. Now, a few technical notes for today's program, which is being held via Zoom webinar. You will see that all participants are muted and that your video feeds have been disabled. As noted in your registration confirmation, today's program will be recorded. The chat function has been disabled. That said, the speakers will be very pleased to welcome your questions, which you can submit via the Q&A function. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A function, which is located at the bottom or on the top of your Zoom window. We will endeavor to respond to as many questions as possible towards the end of our time together. Now, without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Marsha Lederman, who will engage Nora in conversation this evening and facilitate questions from the audience. Marsha is the Western arts correspondent for the Globe and Mail, where she writes about books and visual art, among other cultural matters. She is the child of Holocaust survivors, and her memoir, Kiss the Red Stairs, Intergenerational Trauma, the Holocaust, and Me, is scheduled to be published by McClelland and Stewart in 2022. Marsha grew up in Toronto and began her journalism career in commercial radio in Ontario before moving to CBC Radio, where she held a variety of positions, including national arts reporter. She's lived here in Vancouver since 2007. We are thrilled that Marsha is with us to engage Nora in dialogue about the intergenerational legacies of the Holocaust. I would now like to welcome Marsha, who will introduce Nora.
Thank you so much for that, Nina. Really appreciate it. And good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many people joining us tonight. I can't see you, don't worry. But I see that you have joined and we're really thrilled to have you. Our guest this evening, as you know, certainly by now, is an esteemed author and illustrator whose graphic memoir about her family's difficult past has moved me very much. Nora Krug was born in Karlsruhe, Germany in 1977 to parents whose parents were adults during the Second World War. Early in life, she studied classical music. She attended the Arts Academy established by Paul McCartney in Liverpool, England, and earned her MFA at the School of Visual Arts in New York, where she has lived for nearly 20 years now. She has received fellowships from Fulbright, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Maurice Sendak Foundation, and many others. She is Associate Professor of Illustration at the Parsons School of Design. Her visual memoir, Belonging, A German Reckons with History and Home, won a 2019 National Book Critics Circle Award and was chosen as a Best Book of the Year by the New York Times, The Guardian, NPR, and others. It is extraordinary. So let's get to it. Please welcome Nora Krug, who joins us from somewhere in New York State tonight, where she is on vacation. Hello, Nora.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us and for making time for this while you're supposed to be relaxing. So hopefully it won't be too difficult. Let's start with your childhood. Growing up in Germany, what did you know about the war and your family's role in it?
Well, as a child, I didn't know anything about my family's role in the war. I also knew little about the war, but I grew up in a house whose backyard was directly connected to the US military air base. The US military was stationed in Germany for many decades after the Second World War, basically to make sure that what happened there in the 30s and 40s would not happen again, and also with the Cold War situation looming. So in my hometown, the American military was stationed in a neighborhood that was basically directly adjacent to our backyard. And I saw the airplanes, the military airplanes landing and taking off on a daily basis directly over our house. So as a child, I knew that there was a foreign power basically that was stationed in our country because we had once done something really wrong. I didn't know yet what that was, but I learned obviously more about that, both through conversations with my parents later on, but also in school when we first learned about the Holocaust and the Second World War.
So that feeling of knowing that your people had done something wrong was with you before you even knew what that was, essentially.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was abstract. It was an abstract feeling. But I write about this in my book as well, that certain terms like Konzentrationslager, concentration camp, were somewhere in, they were just in the air. And I knew, for instance, that those places were really sinister places and that people were forced to do certain things there, but I had no idea what it was. But I suppose you pick up the cues all around you and try to piece them together without really knowing what the bigger picture is about.
And then you learn about Jews, I guess, at school, that you didn't know any Jews. You didn't know about Jewish people. You thought they were something very remote. Can you tell us about that?
Well, sadly, we didn't learn much about it. I'm only speaking about my own experience, of course. I can't speak universally for every German's experience. But in my school, we never learned about Jewish contemporary culture, for instance. So we did not really learn about Jewish culture. The word Jew just came up in religion class, where I remember that was in elementary school, my teacher saying, my teacher who was also the local priest, saying that it was the Jews who killed Jesus. And I think that was the first time I actually heard that word. And I came home from school that day and confronted my mother about it. And I said, are Jews evil? And she got really angry because, I mean, I didn't know it then, but because it was so obvious to her that this was something that nobody in Germany should ever think or say. And then, yeah, I didn't know why she was angry, but that was the first time the word even entered my head. But I think it was a big problem that we actually never learned about Jewish culture, because that way it never became a more natural component of life for us. It always remained a subject that we speak about with discomfort, because we only associated it with the Holocaust.
So I wanted to mention that we have a few pages from your book that we have scanned and that we can see. And one of the pages has to do with that story, with your mother reacting as she did when you asked if Jews were bad. And then you made a yellow star for yourself and wanted to wear it in solidarity. And she rightly told you that was not a good idea. I'm wondering if, Florian, if you can show us that picture, if you've got it available. And Nora can maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this was a little bit later on. I forgot how old I was, but it was probably when I was 12 or 13 that we learned about the Holocaust in school. And it's interesting because in Germany, when you learn about the subject, that's really also the time when your teenage years begin, when you ask yourself what it means to be a girl or a boy. So, it's the onset of puberty, and that, so the, this kind of conflict you already experience as a young person is then paired with, or not paired, but in my mind, I think in some ways it was paired with this other feeling of shame. I think I conflated the two of, around learning about what our grandparents' generation had done. So there's a kind of identity crisis in a way that I think to me happened on two different levels around the same age. But yeah, I was completely confused about what the yellow star meant. And in my mind, it basically, I thought that if I made one for myself and sewed it to my jacket, I would show the world that I felt solidarity towards Jewish people, which was completely misguided, obviously. And my mother advised me to take it off my jacket, thankfully. So it's when I started doing the research for the book, I tried to remember all those instances in my childhood and youth when the subject first came up, and how misguided my perspective was, and how the pieces just didn't quite fit together yet. And try to integrate some of those narratives into the book.
So let's talk about shame, this abstract shame that you grew up with, because the other panel in that page that we're looking at deals with you traveling and having people respond to you as a German. And in fact, the book opens with an anecdote about your early days in New York, chatting with a friend on a rooftop, and a woman overhears you and asks, "Where are you from?" And as it turns out, that woman was a Holocaust survivor. I found it very interesting that you started the book that way. It was as if to make this declaration that for the pain and suffering that you've dealt with in your life and your family dealt with. It is, I mean, we don't want to get into a hierarchy of pain, but clearly you're making it very clear who the real victims were here by kicking off the book with the story, which is horrific. The woman tells you about being saved from the concentration camps over and over again by a guard who would knock other people's heads together as punishment. How important was it to you to make that clear? Because that's a difficult line to walk, I'm sure.
You mean in terms of the victim?
The victimhood.
Yeah. I mean, that was one of my biggest concerns and also challenges when I first embarked on this project, was that my book could be misunderstood as me victimizing Germans or downplaying German atrocities or diminishing what Germans had done, what knowingly done. Where in fact the goal of my book had always been to understand better how the memory of the war and living with the legacy of the atrocities we committed is lived through from generation by generation, and also how this memory is passed on from generation to generation and shifts over time. So even bringing up the words pain and suffering in the context of the German experience is something I find very difficult to do. I actually try not to do that. I'm not saying that Germans did not suffer during the war. I think they did, but it was a self-imposed suffering. They had, they had made the wrong choices, and so but at the same time, the book was, needed to be about my experience. I mean, the whole point was for me to broach this subject of, what was actually the German experience, to shed a more complex light on the German war experience, because I think it's an experience that's not very much represented at all, and in the popular media, not at all, in Hollywood. I mean, you don't really get any idea of what the German war experience was like. And, there were so many different experiences a German person could have living through the Nazi regime and the war. And I just wanted to paint a more complex picture than what I felt was available. Because I also found myself often confronted with negative stereotypes as a German living abroad. And I just wanted to, to just create a narrative that would potentially shed some light on that perspective. But so, writing about my own family and sometimes about my family's wartime loss was very difficult. I think those were the most difficult moments in the book. For instance, my paternal grandfather lost his brother. He vanished in Russia as a soldier, and up to today, we don't know how or where he died. His remains were never found. And he was completely against the Nazi ideology. I mean, he was not a resistance fighter either, but he did not want to fight in the war. He was married to a Swiss woman. He lived in Switzerland. He had no interest in going back to Germany to be a soldier. And the letters he wrote to his wife and children from the front line were just love letters. There was not a single heroic word or a single, word that would have expressed his sympathies for the Nazi regime. And they were very humane letters. And I felt that it was important enough to show them, to show excerpts and then to illustrate the excerpts. And I think that was one of the most difficult moments for me in creating the book, was those particular illustrations. How do you convey this sense of a German loss without creating a sense of sentimentality or false victimhood? And, I worked a lot in my book with landscape images when talking about loss. I use landscape photography in the book as a sort of passive portrait, internal snapshot of what I felt at a given time. Again, because I thought it would be problematic to show my, sad face or my disappointed face. So I chose to use landscape photography to fulfill that role of, as an emotional carrier, basically, of how I felt when reading those letters, for instance. But then what kind of landscape picture do you choose? I mean, you can't choose one with, you know, the sun going down, because then again, it's too sentimental. So I went through many photographs and chose that one particular photograph very carefully, because I felt like it expressed a certain amount of gloom without conveying the sense of sentimentality. And how do you weigh image with text is another thing, because it's very similar to films where you have narrative and images and music. And sometimes you have a wonderful balance between images and text, but then the music is so emotional that it just makes the whole thing too emotional. So how do you balance it? That was something I was often confronted with while working on the book. That was a very long response. Sorry.
It is an amazing balance between photography and text and illustrations, but we'll get to that a little bit later, because I think we really do need to delve into the heart of the matter, which is your family. You embarked on this project. You were going to write about your family, but first you had to learn about your family's history during the Second World War. Were you worried about what you might discover?
I'm often asked this, and I'm often wondering why I wasn't. I don't remember feeling worried. I think that the impulse, the urge to ask these questions was so strong that somehow I wasn't worried. I just felt like I needed to know. But that said, I have to say that I think in Germany, if your grandparents were major Nazi figures, you would already know. You would grow up knowing that, because their names would have come up, you know, in the media, or you would have been told something by your family. So I already had a sense that nobody in my family had been responsible for, major atrocities. So I wasn't worried on that level, but even if they had been, I would have wanted to know the truth. But of course, I didn't know what I was going to find. And there were moments during my research during which I was, I felt very uncomfortable. But I can't say I was worried.
So you already knew they weren't resistors because, well, you knew that in your family. And you also look at the voting record of one of the local towns. I think that's another one of the graphics that we have, the voting statistics from 1933 in the local election. I think it's in Karlsruhe. Florian, have you got that graphic available? Exactly, yeah. So you understood that your grandfather was a social democratic voter.
Yeah, so the Social Democratic Party was the second largest party, I believe. I'm not a historian, but you see it here on the top left, the guy with the hat and the hand up in the air. So that was the second largest number of voters in my hometown. And the first largest was the NSDAP, which was the Nazi party at the center. Then there were many other parties, the Communist Party, the German Center Party, which was a Christian party, and then a few, farmers' parties, tiny ones. But the Social Democratic Party was basically the Nazis' strongest political enemy. So they were amongst the first people persecuted by the Nazis, right, in 1933, when Hitler came to power, or when Hitler was elected. And so my grandfather had always told my mother and my aunt that he had voted for the Social Democratic Party all his life. And I have no reason to believe that that is not the case. But yeah, so when I went to the archive to find out more about my grandfather, I don't know if I'm going too far ahead in the conversation.
Well, we are going to talk about that a bit later, but okay, go ahead. Do you want to address it now, or why don't we wait? Let's wait. And sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to make another point about the word resistor. Of course, I knew that my grandfather hadn't been a major part of the resistance movement, the German resistance movement, But then again, it's very difficult to define what resistor means, because there were many ways in which you could resist. I mean, there were whole movements that, you know, with people doing things that risked their lives and the lives of their families. But there were also small things in which you could resist, small ways you could help families in need, or, you know, persecuted families that would not have immediately put your life in danger. And I think that's actually an important thing to, and that I did not know if my grandfather was involved in, because you can't, you know, there's no evidence about every single moment in one's life. You know, there's no documentation of what they did or didn't do throughout their lives. So, so I think it's these terms are very difficult terms to define.
So let's talk about the two sides of your family. And again, I'm going to ask Florian for a couple of graphics here, because the inside cover and then the in the front is a family tree from your mother's side, and on the back cover is a family tree from your father's side. Florian, can you bring up the mother's side? Wonderful, thank you. So Willie was your main concern, I suppose, your grandfather. What can you tell us about Willie and his wartime experience?
Yes, so he was my my mother's father, and he was a car mechanic. The car was a Carl Benz, who, you know, invented Mercedes-Benz, actually was from my hometown. So my hometown was one of the first places where cars were actually made and driven. And so he started out as a car mechanic and then became a driver. And he was a chauffeur before the war. He was the chauffeur for a Jewish man who was in the textile business. So he and that man would drive around the countryside in Germany trying to sell linens to farmers who wanted to marry off their daughters. You know, these, what's it called again in English?
Dowry.
Dowry,
Dowry.
exactly. And so he spent several years working with this Jewish man. And the narrative that was always told in my family was that eventually this Jewish man told him that he had to go away. I don't know when that was. Based on my research, it was in the beginning of the 30s, so before Hitler came to power. We don't know why he went away, but my aunt always told me that he was very grateful for their good business relationship, work relationship, and because of that left my grandfather with a substantial amount of, not substantial, but, you know, a good amount of money. And I don't know if that was just a story that was told in order to make us feel better. You know, I think every family has these myths that are circulating for decades and for generations sometimes, and we hardly ever question them. And I think that was one of the attempts for me in my book, was to actually press the pause button and say, well, did this really happen? Or is this just something we agree happened and nobody has ever looked into it? The other story that was told in my family was that he never had to hold, because my mother and my aunt confronted my grandfather, obviously, like most Germans did in the 60s. Confront their parents about what they had done during the war. And when my mother did that with him, he kept on saying that because he was later on a driving teacher, he actually taught German soldiers how to drive, and that was why he himself never was sent to the front line. So he always claimed that he had never held a gun in his hands. So that was all I knew about him and his wartime experience.
And there was also a story in your family that he might have hidden the Jewish man in a shed behind your house. Yes,
so that is a story that that my Swiss side of the family was, you know, mentioning to me, is that he hid his former Jewish employer in the garden shed of, I think, of his sister in his sister's mother. And I mean, who knows if, you know, it's very unlikely that he did. But
yeah. So let's talk now about your paternal side. And again, we have a graphic that comes from the book cover, which is your family tree, or the inside cover. And there are two, I'd say, main characters of question here. One is your grandfather and one is your uncle. Let's talk about your grandfather.
So the grandfather is the guy with the mustache on the right-hand side with the hay fork. So my father's side of the family came from the countryside, so they were farmers. They had a farm in a village in southern Germany, and he so he owned this farm. He was apparently one of the wealthier farmers in town. He had employees, and again, I mean, I knew nothing at all about his potential wartime involvement. And on my father's side of the family, there were actually no conversations at all about the war. I mean, I don't think my father even confronted his parents about the war and the Holocaust. I think that was just a conversation that never happened. And then my uncle is the younger man on the right-hand side who's wearing the soldier uniform. He was he was supposed to take over the farm as a grown-up man, and when he was 18, he was drafted into the SS, which is something that happened apparently at the time he was drafted. I think he was drafted in 43. Because they were desperate to get, more soldiers. And he died in Italy 1 year later when he was 19. So he never took over the farm. And then my father, who's the boy at the bottom with the hand knit cap or hat, he was supposed to basically fulfill. He was supposed to take my uncle's place, which is a very difficult role to impose on anybody, to take on this life of a person who died during the war, the first son. And my father did not want to play that role, which led to a whole family conflict later on.
And in fact, he was given the same name as the brother, who we can't really see, but there's another graphic, Florian, that shows the two Franz-Karl side by side that I would love to be able to show right now, because it was clearly damaging to your father to grow up sort of in the shadow of this first Franz-Karl, who was the perfect Franz-Karl, although he died fighting for the German army. What is it like for you? Here we see the two Franz-Karls here. What is it like for you to try and find some sympathy, I guess, for, of course, this is your uncle. He was 18 when he died, barely 18. But he died fighting for the Nazis, which is sort of a central theme of the book, this wrestling.
I mean, again, it's so difficult because when of course, many regular soldiers, German soldiers, committed the worst atrocities. You didn't even have to be in the SS to commit terrible atrocities. But there were also German soldiers who did not, who were drafted into this situation that they wanted to get out of, some of whom deserted. So it's difficult to just say, he fought for the Nazis, because every case was different. And I think that's why it's so important to look at every case and every life and all the decisions individual made, specifically. And so all that being said, I can't really say that I ever felt sympathy for my uncle. The sympathy that I just expressed for my grandfather's brother who vanished in Russia, for him, I actually had feelings of sympathy because I could tell based on the letters he wrote that he was a very nice man, and he did just not agree with the whole ideology. He did not want to be a soldier. He hated everything about the war. But with this uncle, I have no proof for that. I mean, I read some of the letters he wrote to his family, to my grandparents from the front line. And, there are a few moments in the letters that felt uncomfortable to me, words he used to describe the enemy in quotation mark that didn't sit well with me. I also found a school exercise book, a school notebook that he had. that he had as a 13-year-old that contained, propagandistic tales that that all students probably in his class were asked to write, that were then decorated in the margins with illustrations by him. There was one that I specifically feature in my book that was entitled "The Jew, a Poisonous Mushroom," which is a horrible story in which Jewish people are compared to poisonous mushrooms, poisoning German society. And seeing his drawings, he made these caricatures of Jewish people looking like mushrooms, was just so chilling. Again, that said, he was 13. But then when you think about it, of course, he was socialized in a different way than we were in our generation. But, he grew up with Jewish children in the village where he lived. And in a small town, you know each other very well, even if you are from a different religion. When you live in a village, you depend on each other, you work together, you have to. And so I do think that he should have known at age 13 that it is not a good idea to compare Jews with poisonous mushrooms. But I also don't know what the assignment, it's just very difficult to, but I think sympathy is not a word that I ever, so I can say I associated with him. I think I was not able to really get emotionally close to him through the process of researching and writing and illustrating the book.
He was clearly indoctrinated, and we do have a graphic from a different page in his notebook where he was writing about Mother's Day. And when I came across that page, when I was reading your book, I was really struck. I was taken aback seeing, we'll see the illustration in a moment, sort of the coloring that a child did in his school book. And Florian, I think you probably have the graphic there. What was it like for you? You found this box of notebooks and photographs when you were a child, and then you encountered it again, I guess, as you were dealing with this project. Actually, it's a different graphic, Florian, but it's okay if you can't find it. It's drawings of swastikas in his notebook. What was that like for you to encounter those illustrations?
It's hard to tell because I can't fully remember the moment when I first discovered them, but I remember my father showing them to me, with a sense of discomfort. I mean, it was clear that my father detested them as much as I do. They seem just from a different time. And, they confused me, but I was also really curious about them. But I think when I was a child and a teenager, I basically accepted them as they were. I accepted them to be from a different time that was a terrible time. And I basically, put them back inside the box, and that was it. And then when I started working on the book, I actually took them out again and sat down with my father, on the phone, because he was in Germany and I was in New York. And we tried to transliterate this hand lettering, which is not used in Germany anymore. And so my father and I spent, several hours going through the entire exercise books and transcribing them or transliterating them. What struck me so much about this one is this contrast between the very familiar feeling of warmth that I think all of us have when we encounter a story of a young child written with, warmth and love for their mother. I think everybody can associate with that. And in particular, this narrative where he talks exactly about what he did. So it's not just a Mother's Day poem he copied from somewhere. It is actually a description of what he did, how he got out of bed, how he put on his clothes, went into the garden and picked flowers for her, how he put a cup on the table for her that said Mother's Day. And it was so touching because it was so real. He gave me this insight into one moment of his life. And I had no other insights into his life. And here he just showed me, half an hour of his life. and he became so real. I mean, that's why visual evidence is so important, because it's so visceral and it gives you such immediate access to somebody's life. But then that is paired with, on the opposite page, a propagandistic tale. I forgot what it was about. I think it's about how Adolf Hitler's childhood, and then the decorations of the swastikas. And so I think that's, to me, what was it's almost symbolic for the whole experience of my writing the book, is what do you do if you grow up in a culture that you basically love, like anybody loves their parents or extended family, or the food they grow up eating, the landscapes they go for walks in, the music they listen to. This is culture. This is what you this is the only thing you have that tells you who you are, you know, when you become a human being. And what happens when that happens in a country that has such a troubled past, where you actually feel like you're not allowed to love that heritage, any heritage about your culture? That's highly problematic for an individual to come to terms with. And I think a lot of Germans of my generations are still really struggling with that they cannot not express their appreciation for German cultural heritage, you know, Bach, Beethoven, all that stuff, and still, you know, continue to look back at our troubled past. And to me, this spread somehow symbolizes that, you know, the humaneness on the right-hand page and the absolute terror and you know, lack of humaneness on the other page. And how do you deal with that, basically?
And outside of North America, the book is called Heimat, which refers to what you're talking about. It's a German word, and it's about, I guess, that love for home, for where you're from. You can explain it better than I can, but you were raised without that. You didn't learn the words to the national anthem. You didn't learn the German folk songs. There was a big absence for you.
Yeah, and when you look at folk songs, I mean, folk songs carry so much truth, you know. When you look at old German folk songs, I didn't really look at them until, you know, later in my life, but they talk about what it means to be a good person, you know, faithfulness, honesty. I mean, all those things that children are supposed to learn in order to contribute positively to society, the importance of nature. All of this is in German folk songs. And when you don't learn them and you don't sing them, you just don't have that identification. And I think that's highly problematic. And in my case, it basically led to my mainly identifying with my family, my immediate environment, but not with German, you know, identity as a whole, if there's such a thing. I mean, you know, it's difficult to pin down any cultural identity, but so I think that's something that most countries find actually difficult. I think Germany is not alone, and you know, in America, often the opposite is the case, that people express their love for their country, but they have difficulty really facing the facts of, you know, the history of slavery or the terrible treatment of you know, Native Americans. And I think it's just, why can't we do both? Why should it have to be a conflict? And in Germany, the problem is that a lot of Germans who are willing and you know, open to looking back at the past from a critical angle, they cannot express this love for their culture. And I think Germans should try to learn to do that, because otherwise we leave it to the extreme right to do it for us. And that's a big problem.
I want to ask you a couple of things about your grandfathers. There is a terrible Kristallnacht attack in the village, and you pieced together that your grandfather's office was right across the street from the synagogue. So he would have had to have known that this was happening. And you go through various scenarios in your mind about what he might have done that day. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that affects you emotionally? And I believe, again, Florian, that we have a photo that we can show here. a panel of 4 possibilities of what your grandfather might have been doing that day.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I always knew the rough location where my grandfather's office had been in my hometown. And I think my hometown is like a small to medium-sized city. But I never knew where the synagogue was until I did this research, which is, you know, again, shocking to me in hindsight. But when I went through the old phone books of my hometown during my archival research, there was a phone book from 1938, the year of the so-called Reichskristallnacht, and it had a map in the back. And so I unfolded the map and I looked for my grandfather's driving school, and I saw that it was in fact located right across from the Jewish Cultural Center, which had the synagogue right behind it. And so I was kind of shocked. Because I knew that this event had happened that same year. And again, though, it was very difficult. You know, of course, he was located right across from it, but it happened, you know, I asked myself, there could have been different scenarios, because was he really standing by his office window when it happened, looking out through the window? Or was he out with a driving student somewhere in a completely different part of town? Was he at home sick? Or was he, in fact, which is the last you know, possibility down there in the corner on the right, was he actually an active participant? Because many people were out on the streets cheering the whole thing on, even beating Jewish people on the street with their sticks and umbrellas. And I have no proof, obviously, of what he did at that moment. Of course, he knew what happened, because everybody knows, you know, when something like that happened, you know. But I don't know exactly what he did and how he responded to what happened, or did not respond, or participated. So again, you know, there are these 3 levels of, you know, opposing, watching, and being a bystander, or actively participating. And throughout the whole book, I found myself, I tried for the book not to condemn too quickly, not to point the finger too quickly and lay the blame, because I think that's just too simple, and also not very effective in understanding what drives people to make certain decisions. I think if we want to really understand how Hitler could have been in power, we need to understand what people were really thinking in a more complex way. But I also didn't want to make him, you know, I mean, free him from the guilt too quickly either. So I found myself the whole time almost as if I had 2 voices in my head. And I don't know if they represented an American and a German one, you know, the German one saying, oh, don't be so hard on him, because people, you know, had to look after their families at the time, and they were forced into certain things. And then this other voice that said, but wait, everybody actually had a choice. People actually did have choices, and they could make choices, even small choices, on a daily basis. And so I kept on kind of swinging back and forth, and I think this image represents this kind of ambiguity for me.
Then you uncover a document, a questionnaire that Willie, your grandfather, filled out for the military government of Germany after Germany lost the war. And you learn some information there. And we also have a photograph of that document. What was it like for you to find that piece of paper and to touch it?
Yeah, I mean, that was a very chilling moment, because, you know, my mother had never had any detailed conversations with my grandfather about his wartime experience. I had no idea what he did or didn't do. And then I went into the archive and I asked specifically for a US military file called Spruchkammerakte. And those were files, so in the Western sectors, after, or at least in the US sector, but I think in the other Western sectors too, after the war, every German older than 18 years had to fill out a questionnaire that contained 313 questions about what they had done under the Nazi regime. And based on the answers you gave, you were ranked into 5 different categories. So the lowest category was innocent or victim under the regime. Then there was like a middle one that was follower, so you followed along basically. And then there was offender and major offender, but in total there were 5. And based on which category you were then put in, you received certain kinds of punishment. So of course the biggest Nazi offenders were given capital punishment. Then there were jail terms, there were re-education punishments. Then there were punishments where you couldn't continue working in your profession, or your bank accounts were barred. So every German had to fill in these forms, and you can actually find them today. They are out there. Many of them are digitized. So I was able to find my grandfather's file. And it was such a chilling experience I was probably the first one who looked at this file in the last 70 years. And I opened it, and you don't see it here, but part of it was filled out with blue ink by my grandfather, so with his fountain pen. And just seeing this, I mean, knowing he held this exact piece of paper, it wasn't a photocopy, it was the same exact piece of paper that he had filled out 70 years or some 70 or 80 years, in the past, was just so chilling, but also very intimate in a way, because I felt close to him. I mean, in an uncomfortable way, but still it was a certain closeness that I had never felt to him before. And so on one of the first pages, one of the first questions was, and this is the one highlighted on the right, was, were you a member of the Nazi regime? The Nazi party, sorry. And he replied, yes. I mean, you see it here where it says ja.
Yeah.
And it was a huge shock, because nobody in my family knew this, and only 15% of all Germans were members of the Nazi party. That was not because more didn't want to join, but that was partly because the Nazis put a stop on admissions early on, when they realized that a lot of people joined for opportunistic reasons. And so you ask yourself, why was your grandfather the guy who said that he voted for the Social Democrats, the biggest enemy of the Nazis, political enemy? Why did he join the party? And I leafed through the file, and the whole file was basically the correspondence between the military government and my grandfather, in which he tried to explain the reasons for why he joined, so that he could be ranked in the better category. And it was like his life was completely unfolding in my hands.
Wow.
And I mean, my mother knew nothing about this. And yeah, it was a very chilling moment.
There's a lot more I could ask you, but we have some questions that I want to get to, but I really do need to ask you this question. You've been living in the US for almost 20 years now, and you're married to a Jewish man. Do you think you would have been able to write this book if those two things were not so?
Well, the first thing, living here is definitely one of the main reasons for why I wrote the book. I think when you live as a German amongst Germans, you accept the collective understanding of how we grew up learning about the war. We learned about it mostly on a collective institutional level, and I think Germany has done, I mean, you can't call it a job, but Germany has done a great job institutionally and collectively facing its past, and it has to continue to do that. But I think where we have to really still catch up is to do it on an individual basis, to really go back into our families, into the archives, into the cities where we grew up in, what happened on our streets, in our houses, and investigate more deeply on an individual level. And I don't think I would have done that had I not left Germany, because I think when I lived in Germany, I felt like, I learned everything there's to learn about the war. What else is there to investigate? That was my thinking. But then when I lived, since I've been living in New York, of course, I am an individual, and I'm the German representing my country. And when you represent a country, you always represent the country's past, because the two are linked together, because who we are as people now is a direct result of what was before. We don't exist in a historic vacuum. And so I suddenly found myself being faced with my history on a much more personal level. So that drove me to go back and research more. In terms of my marriage to a Jewish man, I thought about it a lot, but I don't think that was a main driving reason for me to write the book.
But did it give you some permission on a certain level that you might not have felt otherwise?
It's a good question. I don't know how much it had to do with that, because the permission, that was something I always struggled with throughout writing the book, because I was really worried about, am I really allowed to do that? To talk about the German experience. I don't know if he was very open to it. He had no problem with it. Maybe if he had a problem with it, I wouldn't have written the book. But I don't know if he made me feel like I had permission specifically.
Interesting. All right, what we're going to do is take some questions. Thank you for that, Nora. It's almost the top of the hour, as I used to say when I worked in radio, but we're going to continue because there are questions and I got a little bit carried away with asking you some things. So I hope that's okay. All right. So the first question, thank you for doing this. I enjoyed the book very much. As a high school history teacher, some of my students are already getting fatigued when learning about residential schools every year. Is this a similar experience for German students learning about the Holocaust? So residential schools are where indigenous children and okay, so
Yes, I do think that there is a tendency to feel that way. And in my opinion, the solution is not to learn less, because I think it is very important to continue to learn as much, in my case, as we did in Germany. But I think it's the way in which teachers have to provide the tools for students then to use this knowledge in a constructive way. So if we had learned in Germany, for instance, more about the German resistance movement, we could have applied that knowledge to the present as well and asked ourselves, how can I help minorities that are harassed today? Or how can I make sure that we defend our democracy? And I think the more important question to ask is not what would I have done back then, but what am I doing today on a daily basis, to reflect on the issues that we have in our countries, no matter what country that is. So I think to me, the solution is to make it more contemporary. And I know it's a contemporary problem in Canada, so it's not like it's a thing of the past, but to make it more real, to give the students the feeling that they have that they have a responsibility, to try to replace the term shame with responsibility, basically. But I don't know if you can apply it to the Canadian system so easily.
Interesting, thank you. This question is about your marriage to an American Jew. How have your children, you've got one daughter, correct, absorbed the pain of both being Jewish Americans and German Americans? I want to say that I posed this question as someone who's read her book as one of the most brilliant books of the 21st century, and one that ought to be assigned along with Mouse.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Your daughter's pretty young for this.
Well, I was just going to say the pain she feels is usually from, roller skating accidents or something like that. So she's 5, and I obviously haven't told her about this complicated history yet. I mean, we have this series of, what's it called again? This illustrated book series for children of girls who, became famous. I don't know, there's a very charming series of books. And one is actually, famous is not the right word, but Anne Frank. And she always wants me to read it to her. And I felt really uncomfortable at first because she's 5. And so finally I read it to her, but I changed the text a little bit. And I told her, a long time ago, there was a terrible president. I called him terrible president, who told people that they couldn't live in Germany any longer. I didn't go further than that, but I know that this subject will continue to come up, and I also really believe that if you raise, as a German parent, a child abroad, that you have a responsibility to teach them this history from a German angle and not just from the angle, in my case, an American angle, where it's too easy to point the finger and say, look at what happened over there, and we liberated them. Because I want my daughter to get just a more complex version that also contains a German viewpoint on the subject.
Thank you. Next question. Your book consists of drawing, pictures, and objects, and drawings of objects. What are your opinions or thoughts on the way objects impact memory and the transference of memory to later generations?
Well, I thought about this so much. I think objects are carriers of not only history, but also stories. And I believe that history is an accumulation of individual stories that were experienced through time, and that also the memories of which evolve through time. So I think when we think or write about history, we should not only think of it, you know, in the classic school book way, but also think of history as something that's experienced or was experienced on a daily basis at home and on the streets, collectively and individually. And I think objects really reflect that because they're so intimate. I go to German flea markets every time I'm back and look for this German memory from the 30s and 40s. And I found really scary things and also really interesting things, also really poignant objects. And it's a strange feeling to hold something in your hand that a soldier might have carried in their pocket, you know. And I think they make history come alive, and we have to preserve them. And often they fall into the wrong hands because there are all kinds of people collecting things for weird reasons. I think we should preserve them and put them into archives because they have a lot of stories to tell.
I loved the interstitial, maybe loved is the wrong word, but the pages where you show us what you found at the flea markets. I was really, I was super interested in that. So thank you for that. Next question is about the book being called Heimat outside of North America. I'm not sure if I got that exactly right, but I have a version, I think, of the British version is
Yeah,
Heimat.
that's British. Yeah.
Yeah. So the question is, was it first published in German or translated or an adapted version made in English after? I believe you wrote it in English, right?
Yes.
And then this person, Sarah, is curious about how language, English, German, or otherwise came into play in the writing and creative process.
So I wrote it in English because I wanted to distance myself for the said reasons of discomfort of writing about the German war experience. I needed a foreign language to distance myself from the subject. And also because I knew that so many books had been written in German on the subject that I also felt intimidated by that fact. It felt so heavy already that I didn't want to load the heaviness of the German language onto it. And so I wrote it in English and later translated it myself into German for the German edition, which was difficult at first, partly because I'd never written creatively in my own native language. I had only written academically, but also because I asked myself, you know, how much of this is self-evident to the German reader? For instance, I have these encyclopedic pages throughout the book in which I describe German objects or experiences, or objects and experiences that I personally identify very strong, associate very strongly with a sense of Germanness. And I thought, why would, you know, Germans be interested in that? And then I realized that it's actually when it's too familiar to you that you need it spelled out, because that's the only way in which you can look at something from a distance, is when somebody says, look, this is actually the thing that's so deeply ingrained in your culture and consciousness. Here it is. So the German edition, the translated edition, actually is basically identical with the English edition. And yeah, North America is the only country where the title is belonging. Every other country calls the book Heimat, with different subtitles. And then the Korean edition is not called Heimat because there's a famous supermarket chain in Korea with a similar name. And so they called it I Am a German, which, you know, is probably working too.
Great. Next question. Do you think this lack of German pride or feeling that you have pride in being German is what contributes to far-right violence and racism in future generations? I'm first-generation Canadian, 38 years old. All of my family is German. And the first time that I remember seeing German flags outside people's houses in Germany was for the 2006 World Cup. How do you strike this balance between shame and pride? You actually write about the World Cup. Maybe not that World Cup.
That exact
one,
same one, because that was also the first time I saw the German flag on the street. I think there's really some truth to what this contributor says, that I think Germans really need to learn to love their culture. And I have a problem with it too. I'm not saying I know how to do that, but I do think that it's a dangerous thing to only highlight our guilt. I think, again, we need to learn as Germans to replace the word guilt or shame with the term responsibility. We have to make sure this will never happen again. And also we have to continue to look back. We have to find new ways and new technologies to preserve the stories of those people who are now dying, the generation who is now dying. We have a lot of work ahead of us, and as long as racism and anti-Semitism and intolerance of other minorities or different ways of thinking exists, we have to continue to fight against them. But at the same time, we have to learn to celebrate our culture and our cultural achievements. Because if we don't do that, I do think people will just express this sense of, I'm sick and tired of feeling guilty, which is very similar to what's happening in the US at the moment. And that's just counterproductive.
One of the questions that has come in is, do you see any parallels to the world today, to the rise of fascism that is like what happened in Nazi Germany? You're in the middle of an election. You're a week away from an election in the US.
Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of parallels, like many other people do, I'm sure. The way he came to power, I mean, Donald Trump came to power. The words he uses, the way he uses language, the way he degrades others. There are many, many parallels. Saying that he is like Hitler is another thing that I think we should try to avoid to do, because it's just too simple, because if we think he's like Hitler, we come to the wrong conclusions and we make the wrong decisions. So I think we have to, again, look at every dictator from separately, and try to figure out why, what drives them and what drives the people who support them, and then figure out a way of ideally stopping them. But we'll see about that in a week from now. Mm-hmm. Just my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Mine too. All right. Someone is asking for whether you have any advice for a German person who wants to research their own family during the war. Do you have a main piece of advice, something that you wished you'd known ahead of time before you started?
Yeah. And one of the nicest experiences I have when giving talks in Germany is that a lot of people in the audience ask me this, because I do think that a lot of Germans want to do this. So one thing that I would do is go to the state archive of the state where your relative who you are researching lived right after the war. So in 1945 or 1946, to go to the state archive of the town where, the state where the town was located, and then ask for the Spruchkammerakte, which is a file, which is this military file that the Allies asked, Germans to fill out after the war. That was, a lot of them are digitized. You can do this research also from Canada or from America. Most German archivists speak English, so you can email them and they can pull up that person's name. I think you need their name and their birth date and the town where they lived, and then they can send you the digitized file.
Thank you for that. A couple of technical questions. Someone wants to know why there's no pagination, or there are no page numbers. And someone else asks if you hand draw everything or if you draw digitally. And if you do it by hand, you use pen, color pencil, or something I'm going to mispronounce, gouache?
No, that's great.
Oh.
Well, the pagination is my fault. I told my publisher that I didn't want page numbers because I felt like they were interfering with the general layout. For instance, the page we looked at earlier, my uncle's school exercise book, I wanted the reader to feel as if they're opening his book, and I didn't want there to be this number in the middle of it, or on the bottom of it. I think it's a problem in an educational setting because teachers can't say, please open the book on page such and such. But I did feel like I wanted a more immersive experience, and I felt like the numbers were hindering that. In terms of the method, I never start out drawing in the computer. I always draw by hand because I have more control that way, and I also feel like I need the feeling of the pen on paper. Pencil is my preferred medium, but I've really experimented in this book, and also the reason I really think that the medium and the content have to always make sense together. There has to be a reason for why you choose a particular medium at a particular moment in the story. At least for me, in my book, that was the case. So whatever medium I used always related to what I was trying to say at that moment. And I also tried to experiment a lot because I wanted the book to have a fragmentary character, because I reflected a lot on the fragmentary nature of memory. And I wanted that to be reflected in the images. I have not used gouache, but I used watercolor and acrylic and pencil and collage. Yeah, I think those were the main. And then the English edition, the British and American editions are entirely hand lettered, which I'll never do again. Please don't do this at home. It's a huge, terrible mistake. If you have to change a sentence, you have to recompose the entire image. So now with the foreign editions, I created a font that's based on my hand lettering. And then I work with individual designers in each country who lay out the text around my images, and then I tell them how I want the text to be changed in various places.
Okay, that's a good takeaway. I've gone quite a bit over time, but I do want to end on this one question because it was something I wanted to talk to you about. It's a question for me. As a child of survivors with I Expect Your Own complex feelings about Germans, what was your response to reading the book? And it was something I wanted to ask you about anyway. Thank you for that question. My response was extremely positive. But one thing I kept finding that I was doing was looking for connections. I saw there's, your grandfather was in the hospital after being bombed on April 1st, 1945. And that is the date that my mother was liberated by US troops. Wow. So I went onto the map and I checked how far away they were from each other. They're 400 kilometers away, but they're exactly in north and south of each other. And I thought that's exactly where the line was moving. And that really struck me how you and I have descended from this same history with very different experiences. But I think both of us carrying a lot of weight from them. And I wondered if you look for connections like that as well. When you come across a Holocaust memorial or something, do you wonder about, was my family involved in some way, the people I knew?
I think I always ask myself that when I'm in Germany, walking on German streets and seeing all these memorials. But I think at Holocaust memorials abroad, to me, the Jewish experience is so much in the foreground that maybe I don't feel like I have the right to look for a connection, again, because I don't want to feel like, it is or should be comparable. But of course, those things are always connected because it was the same war and the same person and the same people who caused this trauma. And I was very struck by one email I got from a reader who also was, I think, the grandchild of Holocaust survivors. And she said that one sentence stuck with her the most because she's always asked herself that as one of the central questions about her family, which is the last question of the book, basically, which is, who would our family be if the war had never happened? And I think that's really one of the questions that connects us, because I think everybody's family is so deeply still traumatized. And again, from a German point of view, it's a self-imposed trauma. It was not done to us, but it's a trauma nonetheless. And I think, yeah, that's probably a point of connection.
Indeed. I often think about that. I wouldn't exist if it weren't for the war. That's a really hard thing to swallow. Nora, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much. I believe Nina's going to come back and do a formal goodbye. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. They were so good. Thank you everyone for sending the questions and for being such a great audience. And Nora, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marsha, and thank you, Nora, for sharing your insights with us this evening. I think we all feel that you've raised profoundly personal, yet broadly relevant questions and ideas. And I thank you on behalf of all in attendance for your candor and your commitment to memory. And I'd like to thank our audience members as well for your meaningful questions, really some amazing lines of discussion. And a quick note to all audience members that if you have not yet registered for tomorrow evening's event, which will be a graphic artists roundtable featuring Nora, Miriam Katine, and Leela Corman, you can do so. There'll be an opportunity to advance the discussion. You can find out how to register on the website of the German Consulate in Vancouver. The URL will also be featured in a thank you email that will be sent to you following this program. So again, thank you, Nora and Marsha. Thank you to the German Consulate General in Vancouver. Thank you to our partners, and thank you to all of you for joining us. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night.
Be safe.
Stay safe.